Content warning. This story contains scenes of humiliation, corporal punishment, and the realities of slavery. It treats these subjects with restraint and solemnity. She spat on the slaves without fear, until the night slavery exacted its price. Santa Rita sat on a slow green knoll like a word carved into the landscape. From the road you saw the house first, shutters that gleamed in the sun, glass that reflected the sky as if the world belonged to it. A wide porch wrapped the front, columns painted white though the paint had thinned into fine creases. From that height the plantation watched its own fields. From below at the foot of the slope, the senzala clustered in the shadow. Low roofs, narrow windows, smoke that rose and lingered in a way that made the air feel dense with other stories. Where the house shimmered with trophies of comfort, the quarters smelled of stew, damp cloth, and the iron memory of work. The divide between them was not merely distance, it was ritual, a set of little rules that kept a great wrong in motion. It was the sound of boots on the veranda, the small clink of a teacup, a dismissive cough that folded into command. It was a tongue that practiced gestures of condescension the way some people practiced prayer. Among those gestures, the simplest and cruelest had its place. A spit, aimed low, an act as precise as a punctuation mark. It began as a petty punishment, then became language, a way in which the house spoke to the people who served it. Isabel learned to speak that language before she could read. Her mother taught her, the way mothers teach taste and posture, and how to hold a fan. "Show them where they stand," her mother would murmur over the white cups, adjusting Isabel's cuff as if she were arranging a portrait. "Remind them, don't let softness take root." The words came with lullabies, soft, practiced, and the kind that repair a heart to its own cruelty. Isabel took the lesson to herself like an heirloom. For her, the spit was not only a habit, it was a measure. It could mark a day, collapse an argument, settle a quarrel without raising a hand. When she spat, faces faltered, other hands adjusted their gloves. Bowls and bread and boots found themselves suddenly lowered in rank. There was a clarity to it. She was a tiny magistrate, and everyone learned her law. Bento was one of the first to know the weight of that law. He was a heavy-set man who hauled sacks and stacked wood with an economy of motion that respected the bond between strength and tiredness. Bento had a laugh like a groan, and a wife who sewed late into the night. One morning he set a tray down where Isabel would pass, carrying a stew where a black pepper hung like punctuation. Isabel noticed, the cloth napkin, the way his hand had rested on the tray, too familiar in his calm. She lifted her chin, let the small shape of a spit cross her lips, and the saliva struck the rim of the pot. It was not aimed at Bento's face so much as at his place. It announced in a single movement that he and his kind existed on the wrong side of manners. Bento did not raise his head. He cleaned the spot with the sleeve of his shirt and kept going. Humiliation, once practiced, becomes a thing worn without complaint. The fighter kept his ledger at the ready and his eyes softer than the coronel's. He moved like a man who had learned to translate intent into punishment. His job was to keep the balance, to press the law of the house into the bones of the people who worked the fields. He could be glib when he had to be, sometimes gentler than the tasks he supervised. But he had learned how to read Isabel's small permissions as if they were orders. The coronel, senior to all, sat in a composite of habit and habitations, detached, generous to his friends, indifferent in the ledger that carried names and numbers. His presence was a shadow that made the house grow colder. He rarely intervened in small cruelties. Power in his hands could be a measured thing, sparing the expense of anxiety. Joachim kept the shape of another kind of knowledge. He was an elder who had worked the property longer than most papered lists could remember. His hands were maps of work, calloused, careful, stained with the dye that soil gives to living. He remembered songs that came from the mouth of his mother and his mother's mother before her, lines of melody that were both a memory and a compass. On the nights when the senzala made its small music, pot lids struck lightly, voices threaded over each other, Joachim's song was a chord that gathered them in. It told the calendar of the fields and how the rains migrated. It hid the names of people in metaphors, tucked history into refrains. When he sang, the place of each person in the song made sense. It restored language to those who had it taken. Matthias, younger and brimming with a restlessness that made the earth look like a question, watched everything with the forward impatience of someone who felt time as a stomachache. He had the speed of youth and the kind of hope that tasted like copper. He watched Isabel with a kind of hollow fascination, the way a man watches something he will need to touch but knows he must not. He watched Bento with tenderness and a low fury that found no place to burn. Matthias knew the logic of hunger and the kind of shame that settles when a spit marks your place in the world. Those shames pile on each other like a cart of fertile soil until they become something capable of growth or of collapse. The women of the Senzala were a chorus in whom power and tenderness braided. They cooked, mended, delivered babies, and kept the small domesticities the house took for granted. They had names that the house sometimes forgot. They had songs that the house could never erase because melody is stubborn the way seed is stubborn. When Isabel spat at them, a particular sound, neither cry nor complaint, rippled among them. It was a quiet that bound. It was a way to collect themselves and not scatter. You could see it in how hands moved with precision, in the way they exchanged glances, in the small marks left on clothing. A thread pulled here, a knot hidden in a hem, a folded scrap of cloth that held a note. These were the little relics of their economy, the secret currency that memory keeps when law is designed to erase it. The ritual of the spit repeated like a metronome. Plates bore the occasional wetness where lips had chosen to signal superiority. Shoes, Isabel's, small and polished, spoke of a life cushioned from the earth that did the work. The soles of the workers' shoes told another story, worn thin where paths became necessity. The dress Isabel wore that summer had a sash that her mother had taught to tie just so, its knots as practiced as a prayer. The fabric brushed the cheek of a worker by accident one afternoon, and the worker stepped back as if the cloth had been a command. Behavior hardened into habit. The spit was a punctuation mark. Repeated, it became an article of faith. How easily contempt becomes custom, how small gestures accumulate into systems. There were days when Isabel's spit was almost playful, a tiny arc directed at a man who had jostled her on the staircase or at a cat that had dared to crawl in the laundry. But as summer stretched and the coronels spent longer afternoons under the shade of the mango tree, she grew more bolder. Where once the spit landed on objects, it began to find faces. It took the shape of a performance, a thread drawn through an audience where each witness learned that the performance was not simply personal malice, but doctrine. Isabel's mother clucked her approval like a teacher whose subject is propriety. Neighbors nodded the way people nod at a speech they half believe and half fear. The pattern hardened in routine. Bento's sack slumped one morning. A pot lid bore a drip 2 days later. A girl sweeping the courtyard found a wet crescent along the hem of her skirt. The spit taught them where to stand and how to walk around the place. A child learned to move his head so the spit would not brush his cheek. Another child learned to keep her eyes down. Even the dogs seemed to understand not to cross a certain line. Joachim remembered a time before such small cruelties were ceremonious. He had been younger then, standing under a different moon, when resistance was a whisper rather than an arranged task. He remembered his mother singing of the land and teaching him that soil kept its own score. The earth keeps what hands put in, she had said. It does not forget the measure of a thing. He thought of that saying sometimes while he lifted a sack or tended the roots of cassava that would feed an entire family. The land was patient. It held weights in its brown hands and took them in like a ledger. But patience is not forgiveness. Memory is not mercy. Isabel's particular cruelty found its most public expression one market morning. The coronel had sent some people to town to trade and to settle accounts. The house had been left with a small party of visitors who arrived to admire the plantation's grandeur and to be entertained with warm rooms and intoxicating hospitality. There were plates that had to be set just so, beds to be made, and servants to be arranged like silent props. The day unfurled with a kind of showiness that encouraged Isabel. Strangers meant eyes, eyes meant display. At the edge of a copse near the fields, an old woman took the morning to gather wood for the cook. She moved slowly, which was a body of truth. Slow because years make muscles careful. Slow because at her age the world becomes a thing to be measured with restraint rather than speed. Her basket, woven and patched, rested on her hip. She hummed when she worked, the same low tune that made the work lighter, a song of nests and small domestic miracles. Isabel saw her from the veranda, where she sat fanning herself in the cool of a roof. For reasons she could name as training, or impulse, or hereditary need to mark, she stood up and walked down the stairs the way someone walks to execute a rehearsal. She let her skirts sweep the steps so that her shoes would catch the sun. She carried herself as if she were carrying the right to be above the rest. She did not need to go to the woodpile. She wanted an audience. When she reached the woman, she did not speak. She lifted her chin a little, pursed her lips, and spat. The arc was precise, a small comet that landed not on the ground but on the woven rim of the basket, staining the old woman's hand as she steadied it. The woman froze. The wood she had been about to pick paused in mid-air. Around them the world seemed to contract, as if the air itself were listening for the shape of a new rule. Someone else might have forgiven the gesture as a childish prank. But within that glare of public spectacle, it was larger than the act. It was a claim on the woman's dignity. It struck the old woman where the sun does not reach, the place memory keeps and humiliations live. The circle of witnesses saw what they had seen 100 times, in 100 quiet moments, a small, sharp ritual that made the social order visible. Bento, who happened to be passing, called the woman's name softly and touched the basket to steady it. The woman did not speak. Her lips shaped the remnants of the melody she had been humming, and the tune, cut off, spilled out as a single thread of sound. The other workers shifted like people at a funeral. In the house someone laughed, a short, nervous thing that sounded like a bell misstruck. Isabel turned then, seeing the reaction she craved, eyes that faltered, shoulders that tightened. That evening the senzala did not sing as freely. Voices moved in smaller circles. The women gathered in the dim light and stitched the wound of the day into their work. The old woman washed the rim of her basket with the care of one tending a relic, rinsing and pressing the strands until the wet stain became only a faint memory on the fibers. But memory is not erased that easily. It lives in the way hands tremble while they work, in the small cough that hits a chest in the moments no one is listening. There was an old midwife who kept a kind of quiet archive of the senzala's life, a bundle of names, a patch of cloth here and there, a knot tied into the hem of an apron that carried the color of a particular season. She kept the stories people handed to her, the confessions that came like water into the cupped bowl of her knowledge. When the old woman came to the senzala that night with her basket repaired and the tremor in her hand, the midwife met her at the door and held a small candle like a lighthouse. In that light, the old woman's eyes refused to be mute. She told the midwife the way she had felt the spit as insult and ownership. She said she had the smell of someone else's dismissal on her skin. "They think it is a joke," she said, and the words tasted like salt. "They think we are lessons, but we are not lessons. We are the ones who plant the seed. We raise the harvest. Why give us the measure of a thing that steals from us at every turn?" The question hung heavy. It had no polite answer. And yet for a long time the answer never took the shape of a public uprising. The senzala's world had its own ordinariness. A revolt meant risk and retribution. The coronel could sell a man, split a family, send a boy to work in a place no one would find. Threats took the place of law, and law was something we learned by being taught to swallow. Still, indignation is a muscle. It grows with the use of it. The spit, repeated, ritual, public, was an act that asked for an answer. Matthias dreamed small rebellions. He imagined leaving before harvest, slipping away in the night with nothing but a knife and the music of his feet. His restlessness burned like a fever. Often he spoke in half-formed sentences to Joachim, who answered with song and with the same slow look that had nurtured so many of the younger ones. Joachim did not romanticize escape. He had seen men leave and never make a map of where they were going. He had watched, too, the ones who tried to carry freedom back into the house and were met by simple brutality, a whip, a sail, a woman taken away to keep the mouths of others shut. One night, after a breeze had cooled the fields and the moon had made a pool of silver along the earth, Matthias could not keep the circle small. He told the others what he had saved in the corners of his mind, the names of places he had overheard, the paths that might lead to a river whose boats might take a person away. He spoke with a kind of urgent simplicity. "Fear," he said, "made men cowards, but there are degrees of courage. There is the courage to flee and the courage to hold a place and change the rules. They listened because in hearing, they were making something, a record. The nights were where the senzala held its breath, where small conversations became plans or prayers. Off hours, the house hummed with comfortable sleep and the lights of people who had a right to the rooms they slept in. The senzala's lights were low. The work of the next day required the economy of rest. In those low lights, the women would fold the day's indignities into songs. A line would appear in the chorus about a woman who washed too early and had her cloth spat upon. Another line would speak of a man who kept his back bent and had his name taken in a market. That way, memory did not remain a wound, but became a code. "Remember the earth," Joachim would say sometimes, tapping the palm of his hand, as if the land itself would mark the sound. It remembers who fills it and how they fill it. In his mouth, the phrase was not a threat, but an affirmation. The soil is patient, he told them. It is slow and it keeps. They needed that knowledge to make sense of the world, because the law of Santa Rita pretended to make amnesia the highest form of governance. In that denial, they found their small resistances. When the coronel's son came to visit and brought his own brand of elaborate decorum, Isabel's small performances grew more theatrical. She practiced humiliations with the enthusiasm of someone who saw in each act the trace of inheritance. Her mother watched with that same satisfied coldness, as if lineage were a weapon one passed through the generations. Isabel would pat a shoulder in public and, with the smallest flick, spit on the hem of a servant's dress. The gesture became a ritual that pulled the house together. People in the house adjusted their posture. The fighter wrote down names in his book with a mechanical sound. The coronel smiled and said something about order. It was a totality of small violences, a culture of tiny cruelties that bound the household into a kind of harmony. But habits like that fray at the edges. They create a tension that demands compensation. The day Isabel spat on the old woman's basket, the fray widened into a tear. Something in the senzala shifted like a soil that has been loosed after a compacting. There was talk that could no longer be whispered away. Men and women who had practiced the art of swallowing felt a new hard stone in their throats. And when a community finds a new stone in its center, conversation grows teeth. That night a handful of people gathered beneath the low eaves of the senzala, a crowd built of the small and the necessary. Bento, Matthias, Joachim, the old midwife, 2 seamstresses, and a young woman who had once worked in the house before breaking a marriage and returning. They sat in a circle that made the room smaller and slower. Someone had taken a scrap of cloth and laid it in the center, a pale square that collected the candlelight. Each face in the ring felt the gravity of the action that had occurred that morning. Someone started with the old woman's name and then moved to the history of the house. Names of people who had been sold, of children who had never seen their parents again. They spoke in fragments that fit together like a quilt. "I cannot wear it," one seamstress said, and fingers tightened as if hearing the echo of the spit again would make her cloth shiver. "It is not only an insult, it is an unmaking. They call it nothing," another voice said. "They think it is air. But air becomes a thing when we all breathe it together." Matthias sat with his hands folded, feeling the circle's momentum. He was still young. Anger for him was a draft that wanted an outlet. He did not yet have the careful calculation that years instill. His is the kind of simple courage that says, "Let us act." He caught Bento's eye and saw in him a man who had held the shame down so long his shoulders had changed shape. Bento's hands were large. They had the appetite of someone who worked the earth and knew its patience. Bento spoke little that night. When he did, the room leaned. "We will be punished," he said. The words were not a denial, but a calculation. They will find someone to break, and they will take it out on the easy ones. We know how they think. We know how they pay for what they call order. "We know," Joachim answered, and his voice was a chord tune to all the other chords in the room. He held no bright plans. He offered instead a kind of record, a logic that had withstood many passing storms. "We will not be reckless. There is no glory in being scattered. But we also have to answer in a way that honors us. Not revenge for pleasure, not murder for celebration. We pay a price for every action. Let us count it before we move." The midwife took the candle and held it until the flame made a tremor. She folded her hands like an old woman making a bed. Her kind of courage was the slow courage of one who had delivered a child from a body that had been beaten. She had seen grief sown into people, and she knew the cost of letting grief turn into unmeasured fury. Her voice was quiet, but deliberate. "Isabel's mother taught her well," she said. "They will say we are savages if we move without measure. They will call it vengeance. But we also cannot let them believe that humbling us is acceptable. We must choose the shape of our answer." Discussion unspooled into plan like a string of beads, each bead a possibility. Escape was floated as a dream, and then dismissed as a false currency. A massacre in the house was whispered and rejected for its moral danger. A public complaint considered, but discarded because the law served the house. What remained were acts that would match humiliation with humiliation, acts that would aim not for killing, but for an embodied lesson. They spoke of gestures that would imprint on the house the very thing the house used to mark them. "You speak in riddles," Matthias said, impatient. "Tell me plainly." Joachim looked at him, and through him, at the others. "We cannot bring back what the coronel or Isabel took, but we can make them feel, just once, that indignity has a weight. Not to kill for sport, not to become what they are. A thing that shows them the scale." "We do not want to become the same as they are," the midwife said. "Our souls are not lessened if we make a careful repayment." Bento's fingers brushed the scrap of cloth in the center. He touched the old woman's mended basket with the same tenderness. "If we do anything, we must be ready," he said. "Ready for their answer, ready to lose." His voice was a tally. They argued about details the way people argue about whether to plant now or to wait, about whether to hide a single seed or sow it in the open. The fighter appeared in whispers at the door in the dark, a shadow of someone who belonged to both worlds, part of the house's machinery, part of the community that had learned to live in its margins. He was not present for the conversation, but his name sat in the room like an absent instrument that could change the music. If the house learned of any plan, retribution would be swift. Families could be broken by sales, men shipped away to other estates where there were no relatives to find them. The coronel would not hesitate. He had the luxury of moral economy. He could, if need be, make examples of people and rest. They drew boundaries. No act that would celebrate killing. No spectacle designed to please a hunger for blood. The plan must be solemn, deliberate, a thing that weighed on the conscience of everyone who took part. The moral ambiguity had to be held like a lantern, visible to anyone who would see. In the end, one idea persisted like a seed that will not dissipate. To create a mirror gesture, a way to make the house feel the ritual of being made small. A punishment that mirrored the humiliation the house performed, but not in ways that destroyed life purely for revenge. Something that would be an image, earth on the body, the slow pressure of soil like the slow memory of spitting. Soil is not violent in the way fire is, it is patient. It covers and remembers, and in covering it enacts a slow, immovable justice, or what people might call justice when the system denies them any formal recourse. The choosing of the clearing became a thing of ritual in itself. There was a small hollow a short walk from the fields, a place where the wind carried certain sounds and where the trees made a small face of shade. The clearing had once been a place where travelers camped, and older people said the land there held echoes of arrivals, horses, strangers, and the mud of boots. It was restful and unremarkable. That unremarkableness made it the right kind of place for a deed meant to be read as a mirror rather than a spectacle. It was also a place where the earth felt familiar. There was much that needed to be prepared. Tools had to be hidden, hands practiced for tasks that could no longer be left to chance. Songs were arranged into codes. A particular refrain, one of Joachim's mother's melodies, was taught as a signal. The third line held a note that would mean, "It is time." It was a small, subtle measure, because a world that lived in observation had to learn to hide signals the way one hides a seed. Preparation sharpened the senses. By day everyone moved as if nothing had changed. By night whispers sketched out the limits of action. They had to accept the cost of what they might do. There was talk of the outside, of what would come after, because any action at Santa Rita was not an act simply within the perimeter of the house. It was a tremor into the broader world of estate owners and markets and the invisible web that tied people to places where choices were paid for in flesh and livelihood. And there were small human things that marked the weight of choice. The seamstresses stitched extra pockets into aprons to hide small tools. The midwife held a cloth to her chest, as if sheltering a child she had yet to meet. Matthias sharpened a blade with the kind of intensity that scared even him, an intensity that asked whether the blade would be used to open a path or to finish one. At one late hour they agreed on a day that held a kind of quiet arithmetic, after the next market and before the rains. It would be a time when the coronel was likely to be distracted, and when the house's performance of normality would be most vulnerable to a single pointed counter-gesture. The clearing was chosen, the song agreed upon, and the tools hidden inside a hollow log near the millet patch. On the morning before the chosen day, Isabel walked through the grounds as if habit had given her a right to everything. She brushed past a broom. She tossed a paper napkin in the direction of a woman who picked it up without complaint. Her mother watched from the veranda and nodded once, a small sovereign signal of approval. The air felt ordinary. The house hummed with complacency. That evening, as the sun leaned and the light erased itself to a palette of dusk, someone near the field noticed a small disturbance by the millet patch. A hollow log moved the way an animal might have nudged it. It was a tiny thing. The house would not have noticed it. But the people who lived in the senzala noticed. They knew where tools could be hidden and whose hands might have tucked them there. The night settled with an expectancy that felt almost holy. In the dim light of lamps, someone hummed the song, and it moved through the quarters like a map. It told of weather and seeds, and the ways in which people kept their names. It slipped into a chorus that would be a code in the morning. Matthias stood at a small window and watched the house like a man who is reading a chapter of a book he both loves and loathes. He could see Isabel's silhouette moving behind curtains, the way she toyed with a fan. Each gesture made his jaw tighten. He was ready, to believe that their plan would change the ledger. Furious hope is often the most dangerous hope, because it can confuse moral clarity with the need to do something. Joachim, meanwhile, walked out to the edge of the clearing that night. He moved slowly, each step a conversation with the ground. He pressed his palm to the soil and remembered his mother's words. He said them aloud to the earth, as if the land were a confidant. You keep us. You hold us. You carry our measures. Keep what we give you now, and do not let us forget. He did not say what would happen there. He only folded the memory into his hands like a small coin. The land answered only with a breeze that moved the long grasses. It did not speak, but the wind's tone felt like understanding. People do not make the same choice in a night. They make it over days and sleepless hours, and with the quantity of fear that measures itself in borrowed time. They make it because pain has a threshold, and because justice is not only what courts can give. Sometimes people feel they must enact a correction with their own hands. The moral calculus does not evaporate. It sits in the chest like a stone they must wear. As the chosen day approached, the house went about its business with a particular ignorance. The coronel polished his boots. Isabel practiced new small cruelties in the mirror, testing her smile. The veranda hummed with the same old songs of entitlement. No one in the house imagined that the world could respond with a ritual the way their own gestures had done for generations. They had seen resistance only as something to be removed like a thorn. They had not thought deeply about what it would mean if the thorn itself taught a lesson. On the eve, the senzala's circle tightened. They met not only to plan but to remember who they were before the house told them what to be. The seamstresses placed aside a length of cloth that would one day be a keepsake. The midwife put a small strip of thread between her teeth and tied it into a knot, an old practice, a talisman. They sang quietly, and in their song the names of those who had been taken returned. The song did what songs always do. It made the absent present. You must carry the weight after, the midwife said to them plainly. If we do this, the price is not paid by them alone. We will be watched. Men will be broken and sold. We must be ready to accept the cost as part of our care. They each weighed the price like a coin turned over in the light. The possibility of loss was immediate and real. At the center of that night, with the log of tools hidden and the song practiced until it fit like a glove, the group chose names and roles the way old sailors choose ropes. Who would lead? Who would steady? Who would be the voice? The rules were short and strict. No fury for its own sake, no public spectacle that humiliated beyond repair. Keep the dignity. They chose a single person to speak, if the house asked for an explanation. The midwife, because her words might be treated with a sliver of respect, even by those who despised her. They set a precaution for if things went wrong. A note to be hidden in the seam of a dress, a small bundle of coins buried by a root, a string of music that would tell the rest where the person had gone. When morning arrived, the world seemed at first unchanged. The house prepared its plates. The coronel read his papers. Isabel, insouciant as always, tied her corset and practiced a smile for a guest. The net of ordinary things held tight. But under that net, the people of the Senzala moved with deliberate small acts, each one a bead on the string they had tied. It was then, at the brink of the chosen hour, that an unexpected sound broke the expected rhythm. A dog barked in the distance 3 times, the way dogs have of making the country pay attention. Somewhere a cart creaked. A child cried, and in that crying everything that was planned seemed to wait on a thin thread. They were ready. They were not naive. They had not chosen the shape of their justice without measuring its consequences. They had argued and recounted and tested their courage. They had tasted fear. And still, together, they had found a small, unanimous thing. That a life lived under ritual humiliation must sometimes respond in ritual, because there is no other language left to them. The morning stretched like a breath held too long. In the clearing the earth lay patient and brown, bending only slightly under the wind. The shoes of those who would walk to the place were polished on the inside where the dry dust would not show. The scrap of cloth that had been used as a signal lay folded in a pocket. The song was looped in 2 or 3 heads like an earworm that would not leave. And then the first person stepped from the darkness of the Senzala into the pale light of the day, moving toward the place where an answer would be given to an insult. The world seemed to tilt on its axis, as if the plantation itself would have to find a new balance. The act they were preparing was not yet given a shape that would make history. It was still in that thin early light, an intention, a plan rehearsed in whispers and songs, a moral choice with claws. They walked in the hush before reason and consequence could be measured, and in their steps the earth listened. They walked in the hush before reason and consequence could be measured, and in their steps the earth listened. Before the clearing took a human shape, it had a kind of breath. Grass breathed against ankles. Crickets measured time into small, discrete units. The people who moved toward it felt that breath first as tension behind the ribs, a pressure that was not only fear, but the weight of history settling into posture. They moved as though they carried with them a history that had been stored in bone and thumb and palm, each one bearing a ledger that had been written on their skin by labor and by the household's casual cruelties. Isabel came out alone that morning, a figure practicing the usual performance. She walked with the easy arrogance of someone who had never had a hand in the planting and who believed that soil was something to be kept from her shoes. She had no reason to expect the clearing to be anything but a pale patch of the plantation's geography. They did not shout. They did not call her with insults. They did not parade their plan like a stage. They had resolved in the hush of the nights that their act must be an answer, not a spectacle. Its point would be clarity, not cruelty for its own sake. Joachim met her at the edge of the clearing. He had wrapped his shoulders in a shirt that had been mended one too many times. The seams were visible, like the history of a life patched by small economies. He bowed his head as if to greet her, an old habit of deference that kept a kind of dignity for the moment. Matthias stood close, his jaw set, palms clenched in the way a man holds an animal for the last time before opening a gate. Bento arrived with that silent steadiness that had been his trade for years. There were 2 women near the edge, hands steadied on aprons, faces drawn by something between grief and resolution. The midwife stood slightly off, both as witness and as guarantor of the rules they had agreed upon. Measure, no spectacle, no excess. Isabel laughed at first. She did not yet know she had crossed the most dangerous threshold. There was a small contempt in the laugh, as if the clearing were nothing more than another prop in the stage of her life. Her shoes left soft, round prints on the brown earth. The toes glinted a momentary vanity in the sun. She moved with the certainty of the entitled. They spoke little. Words felt clumsy. What speech could answer habit except to become an equivalent habit? Joachim handed Isabel a scrap of cloth, as if offering her a token of rehearsal. She took it, puzzled, and in that grasp, the plan found its fragile arithmetic. A brief touch, then the earth. The midwife stepped forward, not with a violent hand, but with a patient voice. "We do it with measure," she said, and in that sentence she carried the room's whole compact, that their act should carry the same dignity that had been refused to them. They covered her feet first. That choice had been deliberate. To bury the ground around a body is to mirror what had been done to them incessantly, a gesture that says, "Sit where you have made us sit. Feel the pressure that marks place." They did not press the soil to the face as an act of cruelty, but they did use it to make a physical argument. The earth could doorstep a soul and show where it had stood. Hands moved with the economy of people who had spent lives handing over loads, a rhythm, a mutual coordination. Soil was brought in bowls and cupped hands, not with the spectacle of shovels, but with the intimate, small gestures of work known to the body. Isabel's voice altered as the brown weight touched her toes and climbed her ankles. The first grain that touched skin made her pull a face that was both surprise and indignation. It was always easier to turn the world into jest until the world answered back. The soil grew up to her knees. She began to protest. Her sound was at first a bright, flurried indignation, then a panic that had more to it than wounded pride. Yet the panic was not the point of their action. It had been measured and bounded at the outset by promise and agreement. They had not intended to end a life for pleasure. They had intended to give a ledger a physical weight. As the earth rose, the tempo shifted. Matthias's hands trembled slightly. Bento's did not. Joachim hummed a low line of the song, the same melody that had been a map for them across years, and it steadied the movement like a metronome. The hymn was not triumph. It was a recitation of history, a way of saying, "Look, we remember." Isabel's laughter died into a sound that was almost a plea. The midwife kept her voice soft and deliberate, naming nothing but the covenant, "We will not be bloodthirsty, we will be sure." The woman's face went from the flush of arrogance to the pallor of comprehension, and in that change the whole structure of the plantation shifted. There was no mob to cheer, no one to throw stones. There was an economy of sorrow. When the soil reached the level of Isabel's waist, she stopped moving altogether, her chest burning with the small, violent breaths that come from being strictly constrained. The sunlight turned her hair into a halo around her head that had never known the dullness of back-breaking labor. The people around her fell into a quiet that resembled prayer. They had become, in a moment, custodians of a boundary they did not desire to cross forever. The last handfuls of earth went into place with a ceremony that mirrored how Isabel had, for years, taught them to accept small mortifications without answer. When they covered her mouth with a handkerchief to stop the sound from rising, they felt the cost. They had made a gesture to teach about humiliation, and yet the felt humiliation of the executioners was immediate. Hands that had fed others now pressed soil into another's life. Matthias shuddered as if with cold. Bento's eyes reddened. Joachim's song cut into a single thread that the group held as a tether. This is not joy. This is a ledger we carry. Time existed then as a vertical measure, one handful after another. The clearing received them all. Wind moved across the hollow and picked up a smell that was only earth warmed by sun. The act was consummated, not with a shout, but with a long, protracted breath. When it was done, they stood in the round of the clearing and listened to the silence that followed a thing that has been given shape. Isabel was not buried to the neck. She was not struck down in a frenzy. She was contained in the way their own lives had been contained by force for generations, measured, taken, made small. That was the lesson, both merciless and careful. They left her there not as a corpse, but as a living admonition. They left like people who have lit a lantern and then walked away. The light will last for a while, but soon will go out if not tended. They left because to remain would be to become what they condemned, a spectacle. They left because the rules they had drawn included the painful recognition that they would carry the consequences. When the house noticed Isabel's absence, the shock set a different tempo altogether. The coronel began with the leisure of disbelief. A room searched for a day. is a room that believes itself immortal. It was not until midday, when the meal was called, and Isabel's places were vacant and her voice did not come, that the coronel felt a prickle, the first small crack in the surface of his indifference. His anger did not start as moral rage, it started as proprietorial alarm. To lose a thing of property was an accounting error he could not accept. The servants who remained inside the house were called and questioned in a manner that emphasized the coronel's power more than his curiosity. The fighter's ledger was opened, and fingers traced names like a litany. Search parties were sent out to the fields in the way one searches for an object that must be returned. Horses were saddled. Men were whipped for what the coronel insisted was negligence. Those lashes were not only punishment, they were an attempt to restore a world that had been unbalanced by a small, intolerable disappearance. When they reached the clearing, the first sight did not match the coronel's ledger. The earth there bore prints, indentations of many feet, an obvious human presence, and yet no body lay exposed. There was a small mound that the wind had already started to smooth, an ignorance of its own making. The coronel turned pale and then furious. He did not, in the manner of men like him, imagine moral reflection. He imagined property loss and humiliation before neighbors. He could not abide an answer taught in the language of the oppressed. Word traveled up the slope like smoke. The sentence that lashed through the house was not a reasoned accusation, but a definite story. Isabel had been taken by brigands, spirited away into the night. It was the kind of narrative that dressed impotence in mystery. It was useful, because it allowed the coronel to be indignant without addressing the deeper rot of his own house. The reprisals were swift and particular. Men were whipped to make the story rational to the world. Pain explains absence. Families were broken and hung like loose threads to make an example. Matthias was one of the first to be questioned. He answered with silence until he could not. The coronel's men preferred confession to the inconvenience of long, careful effort. Matthias was beaten and sold. His young body, which had known the rough kindness of the Senzala, was pulled out of the place where memory had been kept. Bento was taken in the hope that the cowardice of others would provide easy restitution. They raided rooms, turned over trunks, looked for clues that would exonerate the house by locating the blame outside it. The fighter, whose position had always been a trembling shuttle between the house and the quarters, was detained, both as an instrument of the coronel's investigation and as a scapegoat who could be sacrificed to restore order. Punishment traveled like a net through families who had already been eroded by the house's everyday cruelty. The midwife was called into the house and interrogated with a disdain that compounded hypocrisy. Someone who had kept so much was now to be accused of knowing too much. She answered with a measured voice and refused to name names beyond what she believed the house would take at face value. She held to the rule she had set, respect the rupture they had made, provide an explanation if one would be believed, and keep the remainder of the story safe. In the days after, the plantation's surface regained its routine like a stage resetting. But a new corrosive silence had taken root. The coronel, furious and spooked, punished in fits of rage. Men were sold to far estates, families were separated, and the house's guests dwindled as rumor lapsed into rumor's cousin, fear. Neighbors who once came to gatherings chose, with small practical gestures, to keep distance. The coronel's ledger filled with empty columns where numbers once were. The plantation that had been a visible demonstration of order found its economy slowly undermined by absence and by the visible wear of moral corrosion. There were also quieter consequences. The household servants who had been complicit or who had looked away now had to live with their memory of what had been allowed to transpire, some of them left in secret. The plantation's crops that year met with a poor dry spell that compounded economic woe. Whether the weather or failing hands was to blame, talk in the region treated the decline as if it were a punishment of the land for the house's moral failures. Guests who had once accepted the coronel's hospitality found excuses to travel elsewhere. Men who had shared leases with his merchants called less and invested less. Debt accrued as easily as dust. The fighter's condition was complicated. Detained in the house's own small prison room, an upstairs cell with a narrow window and the sympathetic silence of men who had been the coronel's instruments, he began to fracture. He had been the translator of orders, the man who had written the ledger that made human beings into numbers. Now the ledger came back to haunt him. He had the surgeon's knowledge of how the house's mechanisms worked, and the craftsman's knowledge of who did what. At night, alone and watched, he began to speak to the midwife when she visited under the pretense of nursing a cough into the house. The fighter's confession, years later related in a whisper, was not the neat narrative the coronel demanded. It had been a messy human thing, a man who had been raised in obedience and who had been taught that loyalty to a master could survive any humane question. He said that in the days after Isabel's disappearance, he had walked to the clearing and stood there, and understood at last that he had been both the instrument and the witness of a thing that had no right to be. He confessed to the midwife that he had helped in trivial ways, movements of people and goods, the omission of full duties, out of a fear that any action would break a life he could not afford to lose. In that confession was not redemption, so much as the slow unraveling of a man who had been asked his entire life to be the machine that kept a house running. His words were a scar on the midwife's memory. She wrote nothing formal. She had no institution to hand the confession to, no court to write it in, but she tied into a hem a strip of cloth that she later wore under her apron. The cloth carried in its fibers the fighter's trembling speech, kept as privately as the love letters of those who dared not hang them on the line. The midwife understood complicity as a wound that could not be fixed with blame alone. In the months that followed, rumor braided with practical brutality. The coronel's men turned to easy targets in order to restore the narrative the house wanted, that the world remained under his command. Slaves were sold, houses were searched, the plantation erected a new regimen of discipline, yet each harshness left another wound in the social fabric that could not be mended by fear. The economic cost of moving people in and out, the drop in labor efficiency as trust eroded, the small rebellions of quiet resistance, these were the accruing charges that the house could not simply write off. But memory is not only for the present, it persists in the small artifacts that survive the violence of official histories. In the weeks after the clearing, the women of the Senzala returned to their work with the practice of concealment as their trade. The seamstresses stitched fragments into hems, a thread of the dress Isabel had worn that day, a silken sash with a small, deliberate stain, found its way into an apron that would be worn for years and then frayed into a child's rag. Her shoe sole Isabel had left at the steps, polished and small, was secreted behind a rock by a man who could not forgive, and later a child found that sole and tied it to a plaything, and then, as an adult, stitched it into a memory quilt. The midwife kept the last scrap of basket fiber the old woman had mended after the spit. It smelled faintly of smoke and cassava and the long afternoon that had become a ledger. These objects became carriers of testimony. They were not for the legal record. There was no legal record where such a deed would be honored. They were for the community's archive, the private museum of a people who had to carry their own story, because no official arm would take it. Children grew up with tales threaded through lullabies. The song Joachim had used as a signal remained in the repertory, but its third line held a particular note that signified the clearing. Parent to child, neighbor to neighbor, melodies kept the story alive in a cadence the house's records could not document. Matthias, who had been sold after the searches, left a different kind of trace. He fled after months in a new master's yard, and he found his way to a town where he married and worked small trades. He never found full peace. He carried the image of the clearing like something thumped into his chest. In rare late nights he would sing the melody in the dark, and the words would come like a confession. His children learned the tune and knew only that it held a wound and a lesson. Years later, when Matthias returned in secret to the edge of Santa Rita with the fading courage of an older man, he dug at the clearing and found only the softened heap of earth and the weather's forgetting. He cried then, not for Isabel alone, but for all the small economies of life that had been broken. No judicial reckoning came. Landowners in the region had no interest in scrutinizing their peers. A scandal could undermine the fragile networks that kept market and neighborly favors in motion. The coronel, disgusted and isolated, found in the following years a kind of solitude. Friends took distance, marriages through his circle cooled, trade partners wrote less often. The house's carpets dulled, and so did the sound of conversation in its rooms. Windows stayed shut more often, as if the air outside might bring news worse than any ledger could record. There was, however, a different kind of unspooling: reputation. The word that a plantation had done something terrible travels farther and in a different register than the law's punishing hand. People whispered about the fate of Santa Rita and about the missing woman whose absence could not be squared with explanation. Visitors who once wanted the coroner's company now wrote with a cold courtesy. Local judges found small reasons to avoid visiting. The plantation's children, who had once loved thrill and ease, began to find their games less fun when they crossed the land where a life had been enacted as reproof. The fighter, eventually released from detention because his skills could not be wasted on an empty plantation, lived out his life with a different kind of penalty. He had been spared the gallows of public censure in exchange for a private legality. He was paid in coin for a while, then not. In old age, he could be found by the midwife sitting on a small wooden bench, hands folded, eyes hollow. He told the midwife small bits of truth, and sometimes he cried into the cloth the midwife had sewed into her apron. He ended not as a villain, nor as an absolved man, but as someone who had learned that complicity has a long, sour price. He confessed his small betrayals and asked for no absolution. The midwife gave none. She listened and guarded the confession like a relic that could not be displayed, but which must be remembered. Years passed, and the plantation slowly slid into a different kind of ruin. Children of the coroner's house married away in search of alliances that would not tie them to Santa Rita's name. Commerce moved its favors to new centers, and yet the land remained. It kept the record of every footfall. The clearing gathered moss. Trees grew higher along the boundary. Rain softened the edges of the mound until it read as a small hill, nothing exceptional to passers-by who did not know to read the song hidden in the earth. The story, however, did not die. It lived in the midwife's notebooks, kept in a trunk under straw and later in the hands of a granddaughter who became a woman with a habit of listening to elders. It lived in a song that children hummed when they did not know why they hummed it, and in the thread an old seamstress had woven into a child's apron. It lived in the small stubborn pocket, where the fighter had hidden a coin that many took for granted, but which someone later donated to help a child of a sold man. It existed as fragments, a stain on a sash, a soul stitched into a child's toy, a melody hummed in a kitchen. Those fragments were touchstones for a people who recognized in them a story of measuring and response. Decades later, when the region had shifted and new roads had been cut, a scholar passed through Santa Rita. He was not the institutionally arrogant sort who came to set law in motion. He was the kind who listened. He met an old woman on a porch, one who had been a child during the time of the clearing, and she hummed him a line of melody when he asked if people still sang old songs. He took down the tune and wrote it on the margin of a blank page, not as verification, but as an offering. The midwife's granddaughter showed him the apron with the hidden thread and the scrap of basket fiber. A young man who was the descendant of Matthias brought a small bundle, a soul, blackened with time, but still with stitching visible at its edges. The scholar's notes would later be filed in a university archive, cross-indexed with other oral testimonies. People came then who wanted to read the land's record: anthropologists, local historians, a niece of one of the plantation's former servants, who made it her life's work to retrieve stories. They sat with old women in kitchens and recorded songs that had never been meant for other ears. They found the clearing and felt the slope of its soil, and heard wind that seemed to tell them the same thing Joachim had said years before. The earth keeps what hands put in it. Yet even as some version of truth was recovered, the moral calculus remained unaltered. The deed had been an answer that carried further consequence than the short relief it had given. Where once the family of the house had been insulated by privilege, they now bore a different kind of poverty, one that could not be measured in coin. They carried the knowledge that a ritual of contempt had been matched by a ritual that had cost their own people dearly. The act had not produced a new justice administered by law. It had produced a long aftermath of dispersed losses, of lives sold, of men like Matthias who could not rebuild what had been taken from them. Was it justice? That question hummed quietly among the songs and the threads. Some said yes because at last the house could no longer wear the same confidence it had before. Others said no, because the price had not balanced neatly. It had diffused. The debate was not part of any court. It lived in kitchens and in the feet that had walked away from Santa Rita, and in the patchwork of stories that people whispered to leaning ears. Memory, in the end, proved more faithful than immediate redress. It kept what the law refused to hold. It told the story with all its ambiguities, a people forced to choose a response, a woman who had spent her days practicing contempt, hands that placed earth on another. The song that Joaquim's mother had sung kept a certain line that altered in each telling, sometimes softened into forgiveness, sometimes sharpened into warning. It was not a song that fixed moral certainty, it was a song that made people remember. Years after, children who had heard the story in childish forms began to look at the clearing and see it as something other than a hill. They saw marks at its rim that were not made by any heavy plough, a thin indentation like a student's fingers tracing a margin, and a small stone that had been set there by someone who wanted the earth to keep its guardian. They buried small mementos there, never as a shrine but as a private pact. They taught their own children to sing the tune without explanation, as if instruction could be wrapped in melody. Isabel's fate remained part of the region's private dread. Some versions had her leaving for good. Others said she never left the clearing but was found later, changed. The midwife's version, whispered and kept, said little about whether Isabel had lived or not beyond that first season. It said instead that the woman had been made small in the very way she had made others small, and that such reduction carries a cost that pollutes the hearts of those who enact it and those who enable it. Matias' line continued in the village and in distant towns. A grandson of his would one day bring to a small museum a patched apron with a silken sash folded within, inscribed with a tiny note, "Keep the song." The midwife's granddaughter became a keeper of stories in a way she had not intended. She recorded names and dates and the odd thread, and then left the trunk unopened until someone else asked why she kept such things. That person, a local historian, recognized the pattern and began to place the fragments together like a slow mosaic. At the edge of the clearing, an old tree leaned as if in remembrance. Its roots cupped the earth where the mound had been, and in its bark one could see the outline of a hand where some child had once carved a mark. The tree's leaves held wind that sounded sometimes like a chord of the old song. People would sit under it on certain evenings and hum because the song made their mouths move without their minds deciding. That was the land's testimony, quiet, persistent, indifferent to the notion of tidy justice. In the end, the story did not resolve into a simple ledger of right and wrong. It kept its ambivalence like a closed fist, sometimes opened in tenderness and sometimes clenched with regret. The community that had acted had paid abundantly in ways they had foreseen and some they had not. The house had been shorn of a pride that wealth could not replace. The midwife and Joaquim kept the song and some small artifacts and taught the younger ones to listen. The fighter kept his shame and told it to the midwife until his voice was a thing worn down by time. Matias's family carried on in new places with songs that had the clearing at their center. Time, which the coronel had believed he owned by right, proved to be another kind of judge. The land, patient and plain, kept its record. It remembered the measure of a thing and gave back, in small, stubborn ways, the evidence that names could not wholly erase. The cost of empire of manners had been tallied out in the lives of people who had never been paid for their work. The answer to the spit had been given in a way that left a debt unpaid on both sides. They still told the story, around evening fires in kitchens in the hush between the cassava being pounded and the pots simmering. The refrain that began with a mother's lullaby ended not in relief, but in counsel. "Remember the earth," Joaquim had said, and they said it again, not as a threat but as a charge to listen and to hold. She spat on the slaves without fear, until the night slavery exacted its price. The phrase lived on like a caution, not as a sweet victory but as a stern record of the cost of making others small. The clearing remained. The song stayed threaded through generations. The apron and the shoe and the scrap of basket fiber passed hands and told the truth that laws had refused to set down. That memory is a living ledger held by the land and by those who sing. If this story has touched you, consider carrying its memory forward. Share it with someone who will listen, seek out the quiet histories in your region, and value the small artifacts and songs that survive when formal records do not. The land keeps its score. It receives the hands that plant and the hands that bury, and it keeps what was given. We learn, if slowly, that the price exacted by systems of humiliation is not paid by one night alone. It is paid across years, across households, across the small bones of children who inherit the melody. The duty of those who survive is to remember without simplification, to hold the costs in full sight, to listen for the songs that count what law could not, and to give to memory the respect the living had been denied.